And some of y'all so woke, you need to be slapped to sleep. It's like no. But for real though, I think that for a lot of us, our need to bring awareness to our oppression makes it difficult or gets in the way of us finding a solution for the things that we go through. Walk with me, right? Because I know that might sound crazy. But I don't know if y'all seen it or not, but there has been conversation on Twitter about Ari Lennox and how she was responding to Martin, basically saying that like as a dark-skinned woman watching Martin and how they always interacted with Pam kind of like really impacted her. And so as I'm watching the video, like my girl is not saying nothing wrong. Like that's her experience and I can definitely understand like everything that she was saying because it made sense. What was so interesting is that while watching the video, I had a thought like, well, I love Martin. I've always watched it. I love Tachina, Arnold. And when I watched Martin, like I never really like got the feeling that like Pam was like this victim. But I'm also not a black woman, so I really can't speak to how like that might impact black women, right? So as I'm scrolling the timeline, I'm like seeing like folks get into like huge arguments just over the seriousness of Martin talking about Pam or interacting with Pam in the way that the show has. And so when I was watching or reading the discourse back and forth, I just thought that it was so interesting, right? Because y'all already know, like I have this like thought that like nobody, or let me not say nobody, but a lot of people these days really do not have media literacy. Like folks are not able to identify context clues. Folks are not able to draw inferences. Like folks are not able to craft the hypothesis, right? And I think like because of that, right, that leads to a lot of the stuff that we see happening on the internet, happening on our timelines, happening on the news, right? Nobody is literate. Nobody can read. Nobody can understand. Nobody can synthesize information. So as I'm watching the discourse, I'm thinking like, oh, this is so interesting that people had a different experience watching this show, right? And so the conversation on Twitter turned into this whole thing of like folks feeling like people are trying to downplay colorism, because a lot of the comments were basically saying that the show never really like mentioned her skin color or none of that. And my thing is like, stop playing. Even if the show never mentions somebody's skin color, the fact that that person is always the butt of the joke and that person looks a certain way and the way that they look also is synonymous with the way that our world works and interacts with people. It's always going to translate because she's dark skinned, regardless of if that was the point of the joke or not, right? So that had me thinking, right? Like y'all always know I be thinking. I love to think. So I started thinking, and as I'm thinking, I'm like, wow, this is so interesting. Like folks have this limited scope of how they analyze oppression. When I say that folks have a limited scope of how they analyze oppression, I mean that their analysis stops at a certain point. For example, we're watching Martin, right? Say that the jokes that he's cracking on Pam, people can pick that up and say, hey, that's wrong. You shouldn't be saying that about that person because of all of these isms that we have within our world, right? So like, stop saying that. However, that's where the analysis stops. Nobody continues to identify how that person reacts after they have experienced whatever injustice folks feel that they experienced in that moment. So the question becomes, how come nobody wants to analyze that Pam always reacts in a way that affirms the fact of like whatever is coming her way can't stop her because she already knows she got it going on? Like how come we can't add into the conversation that despite Pam always being the object of these jokes of ridicule that can be seemingly due to her being a darker skinned woman, she always defied the odds. She always came back. She always had a comeback. And then even on top of that, all of the men on the show wanted her. At different points in time, everybody had a crush on Pam. Even Martin was dreaming about Pam, right? And so I think that what's missing when we analyze oppression is how do those groups of folks who are oppressed, how do they respond to the things or the injustices in that moment? And to me, I think that that's where the lesson lies. I don't believe that the lesson lies in the fact of telling folks or like saying to folks, you can't say that, you shouldn't say that because that's wrong. Because ultimately, I think everybody already know what's wrong. Like we all live in the same world. We all socialize the same way. We all see what's happening. So I think that people know. So us bringing awareness to that is doing nothing but distracting us from getting to the solution, right? And so that reminds me of this quote from Toni Morrison that basically captured that racism is a distraction. It keeps you explaining your existence. It keeps you fighting to be seen as valuable, and it stops you from doing the work that you probably should be doing to actually change the systems in which you live under, because you're so busy fighting and screaming, this is me, value me, right? And so ultimately, I think that one, people can't get over the fact of like that bad thing is happening and it shouldn't be happening, and be able to say this is what we need to do next. Granted, it's wrong. Colorism is wrong. Racism is wrong. All of the isms are wrong, right? But that's the world that we live in. We have to get acquainted with reality. That's the world that we live in. So can we be mad at Martin for depicting the world that we actually live in on the show? Like, can we really be mad at Martin for creating a show in which the object of his joke might be a dark-skinned woman, considering that happens every single day, right? Or do we analyze that to say, okay, that's happening in our world too. Let's see how Pam reacts to that, and then what happens in the show, and then think about, okay, how can I implement this in my own life, right? And I think that for a lot of us, that is the piece that's missing. Anytime that we analyze anything, we don't take it a step further. We don't try to connect the dot. And I think that when we start to do that, we'll have a better understanding. Like, this whole thing reminds me of either or thinking, which is a function of white supremacy, right? And it tells us that things are either good or bad, right or wrong. People are either for us or against us. And what that does, it discounts the nuance that a lot of the things in life call for, right? And it doesn't give us time to consider a lot of the complexities that might be at play in the things that we are interacting with, right? And so when we're thinking about some of these complex topics, right, you might find yourself thinking like, okay, that makes sense, but what about this, right? Or I hear that, but then this might happen. So we need to really understand nuance and like take time to consider things that might be going on. But when we have these conversations to where folks feel the need to only say like, don't say that, it kind of stops us, right? And it blocks us from that. And so when I think about this situation with Ari Lennox talking about Pam and Martin, right, I think that this situation puts us in an either or space, because it makes people feel like you have to be upset that Martin had a show with these colorism jokes, or that means that you are support in the unfair treatment of people based on their skin color, right? And I think that that's super unfair. And I also think something that's missing is like when we talk about conflict and when we talk about oppression and we don't include the narrative of those who might have been marginalized within that moment, we're only sharing the story of the oppressor and ultimately aiding white supremacy, right? Like, I see that most often when we think about slavery and how the stories of the enslaved are told, right? Oftentimes, we don't really hear the perspective of the enslaved. It's always from the perspective of a slave owner, right? And so when you have the perspective of a slave owner, but not necessarily the perspective of the enslaved, what you're missing, because you're not getting the perspective of those who are actually marginalized, you're missing how those people might have fought back in those moments, how those people might have revolted in those moments, how those people might have resisted and build confidence and self-esteem within those moments, because you don't get that narrative, right? And so when we share stories of conflict, or when we analyze stories of conflict, and we only stop at you should not do that because that's wrong, you should not do that because that's wrong, but not include how those who were wronged actually responded to that and actually overcame that, we're doing a disservice, because how can folks know the true perspective of the marginalized in that moment, right? We have folks walking around living and breathing, shaping their perspective based on skewed narratives, because the full stories of both sides are not being shared, right? And that leads to detrimental impacts. Think about this. Imagine that you're a black person learning about slavery and you only heard things that were reminiscent of like slaves came over here and they just did the work and they didn't fight back and they had no problems and they were lazy, so they had to be slaves and they had to work, right? Like, hearing those things, say that you internalize those things about yourself, and say you never hear about the ways that those who were enslaved fought back. Say that you never hear about the ways that they overcame, right? That will ultimately impact your level of racial self-esteem as a black person. So now you're walking around the world with low racial self-esteem based on half narratives, because we never share or hear the side of those who are oppressed. Not when we share the history or even when we're analyzing the conflict, right? So now that means we have people walking around with a self-identity that is based on half truths because both sides were not shared. So I think that when we're talking about this colorism conversation and the depiction of like real life issues in media and in TV, I think that it's important for us to always include in our conversations about like different types of conflict, how those who were involved in that conflict also responded. I think that when we do that, we'll do ourselves a better service of shaping the narrative of those who might belong to those marginalized groups, and ensure that like we aren't painting them as these docile victims who are always discarded, but showing that despite their lived experience, despite always being the targets of things, they have overcame and have constantly shown that they are valuable and should be a part of this society, right? I definitely think it's totally okay to criticize how different isms show up in the world, right? But I always want us to be sure to always include the narrative of how those people also responded. When we think about that, when we share those stories, we're able to really get a fuller picture of, one, how the world works, what we need to do to kind of combat these systems within the world that we live in, and we'll have a better perspective that might be more accurate of the people who might belong to those marginalized groups, and not have these perceptions of them based on the side of the oppressor only. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.